So, welcome everyone to this session. My name is Tim, and I'm at the University of Michigan. I've been using MAXQDA for well over 10 years at this point, probably close to 15, honestly. And I'm, very passionate about the visual tools. I specialize in mixed methods research, and much of my work is around visuals and in mixed methods research in particular. So I'm excited to be here and to talk a little bit about these tools that I really find so incredibly valuable. So here are the tools that I'm going to focus on: MaxMaps, Code Relations Browser, Code Matrix Browser. I see those as kind of really important starting points for me for an analysis after I have completed coding. But then I'll share other tools, including the code map, document comparison chart, portrait code line, profile comparison chart, and then word trends. So we'll go through word trends. So we'll go through each one of these in a little bit of detail. My plan is to go through slides, and then at about the midway point, I will move over to a MAXQDA from an example project of a project of mine actually that I've worked on, so that I can show how to implement some of these tools and also comment on their uses and analysis. So starting with MaxMaps. MaxMaps is really at this point a massive feature in MaxQDA, certainly deserving of an entire spotlight session of its own. But you can do quite a bit with MaxMaps. So it is a visual tool. It's one of the really important visual tools within MaxQDA, and that's why I'll kind of start with it. Through MaxMaps, you can essentially represent virtually any element that's in MaxQDA. So codes, documents, you can bring in memos, coded segments, and honestly, I should even mention, I failed to include on the slides, but you can include paraphrases in MaxMaps or MaxMaps. You can also include some summaries as well. So it's really a useful tool to kind of bring all of those elements together. When I think of MaxMaps, though, I think what it really does is it allows you to create a concept map. So think of a concept map as showing how different elements of your data relate to one another, relate together. So how do codes perhaps relate to each other? You could visualize that. How do codes relate to documents? What's the pattern among documents? Do you see, clusters of codes being applied in some documents but not in others, or across document sets or across document groups? So there's really quite a bit that you can do with MaxMaps. And I think that's important because it can allow you to think about not, just simply having static themes, categories, or codes, but to really think about the relationships among those codes. And at least, most of my work, if I'm doing a purely qualitative study or a qualitative component of a mixed method study, our themes do interrelate with one another. And part of that is by design, whether you're conducting something like a grounded theory study where you're literally building a model of how different concepts relate to one another, or even if not, I think often you can visualize how these different elements relate. And I think it's an important additional step in your analysis process. What you can then do is take these maps and organize them into a logical flow of ideas. So you might think of starting with something like a map, and that can become a good way to structure a results section as you're writing the results of either a manuscript or a thesis or a dissertation. And you could certainly include that figure. So some specific uses of MaxMaps, visually depicting a grounded theory model, of course, but also thinking about how your codes might link to themes or also cases, in addition to conducting cross-case comparisons. With really all of the maps that you generate in MaxQDA, you can export these in a PNG file, a JPEG file, and I believe there are additional formats as well. These are what I tend to use most often. And you can even set the transparencies, whether it's a solid color background or it can just be pasted into whatever it is you're doing. And the quality is really quite good. So it's something that I would say is manuscript ready. in terms of what you might be able to put into a manuscript or some kind of report. So here's an example of a map from actually the study that we'll be looking at in just a moment. And these are codes. So just so you can see what that is. So this was a study looking at cardiac arrest events that occur in hospitals and really trying to understand processes related to that. So I had these codes kind of grouped into what happens pre-event and then what happens during, and that's what I'm focusing on here. Of course, there were many other codes in this project, but what I've done here is created a map so that you could show, or so that I could show really subcodes that are related to these codes themselves. So what I then did in addition to that is you can see the weighting. And that's lines that are weighted that are thicker than others, and that indicates the frequency of a particular code. So it's again a way to visualize that. And of course, frequency is not everything. It may or may not be important, but it could give you an indication of patterns when looking at Max Maps. So I'll continue on and I'll talk about the code relations browser and code matrix browser next. And then at that point, I'll switch over to MAXQDA and we'll look at some of these features before I continue on with the rest of the visual tools. And if you do have questions that arise, please put them in the Q&A and I'll try to reserve plenty of time at the end when I'm going through so that we can answer questions that you might have. So for me, the code relations browser is really an important starting point. After I've coded my data, I use the code relations browser to start to identify patterns, and identifying those patterns, those relationships, helps me to then identify themes. So a code relations browser allows you to look at a couple of different things, but for one is whether codes occur together in a document. So think about whether codes are likely to be applied together to a segment of text within a transcript. Now we can also look at proximity. So rather than overlap, we can look at whether codes are applied next to one another, say within a paragraph of one another. And we'll look at some of those options when we're actually looking at this tool. So this is under visual tools. You'll find the code relations browser. And then at this point, you have a choice of what you want to array as your rows and what you want to array as your columns. You can include all activated ones, or you can select, certain ones that you want to focus on. I often recommend limiting this a little bit. You might start with all rows, for instance, but maybe only have certain codes that are appearing as columns. And this can just help to focus your analysis a little bit. So finding the code relations browser, as I said, is under visual tools. You come to code relations browser, and then here's your initial dialog box. So you can indicate what codes you want to focus on. And in the newest release of MAXQDA, you can actually select which codes you want to focus on. So if you didn't activate previously, you can select it here in this dialog, which is a great new feature. And then the same goes for your columns as well, picking those. And then looking down here a little bit, you see type of analysis. And again, that's where you can indicate if you're looking at an intersection. So there's an overlap of codes applied to a segment, or you can look at proximity, or simply if they occurred within the same document or not. So by default, the code relations browser will then return to you different size boxes that indicate the frequency of this co-occurrence of code specifically. You can instead look at the actual number in addition to that. So we'll just look at the browser itself just so you can see what it is. So as I mentioned, it has a different size box to indicate that frequency of co-occurrence. So if I look at this, this kind of first red box here, so it's large, that means that we applied the code rapid response team and cardiac arrest occurrences together, fairly often relative to some others. As I said, there are options you can toggle. So I could actually see that the number of co-occurrences of those codes. If I click on one of these boxes, it will then take me to a query, essentially, and retrieve segments where I can then read those segments of text. So the just the number itself, the frequency of co-occurrences, again, may or may not be important, but this is a way to start to think about patterns. What are patterns that you might be identifying? Depending on your analysis, if you're doing something more like discourse analysis, or it's really important to look at, what was said in a precise way, or when it was said with a proximity relations. This can be a great way to do that. But again, this is just frequency. So what I would then do is click on these boxes of interest and then read actual segments of text. And that really helps more with a sense-making process. And then really continuing on thinking about those patterns and identifying some themes that you might have, or categories, depending on what your goal is next. So for a code matrix browser, it's kind of a similar idea. So it sort of looks like a crosstab or a contingency table in statistics if you come from that background. But a code matrix browser is different because it allows you to compare documents as columns, or document sets. So with this, we can look at, again, the frequency of codes as applied to a document or document sets, and then help to identify patterns among those codes as well, again, as a way to perhaps think about some larger themes or takeaways or findings. So if you're not familiar with it, I just want to mention creating a document set, because this might be an important way to start with this. So a document set is kind of like a document group in a way, but the advantage of a document set is that a document can be part of more than one document set at one time. So you're not really moving the document. It's kind of like putting a tab or a tab on that document. So this is the bottom of your document system. You can right click on it. This is how I do it. And then click New Set, and then identify what that document set is. So it might be by site, for instance, or it might be by type of individual that you interviewed. Maybe you interviewed teachers and you also interviewed administrators or principals, and you want to group those into different document sets. Or maybe you have patients and nurses, or leaders in organizations and employees, again, depending on whatever it is you're doing and what makes sense for your analysis and your research questions. And then one way to do this is to just simply drag your documents into the new set. If you have variables attached, you can also activate your documents by variables. So let's say you had a variable for site, and then create a new set at the same time. So here's an example of a code matrix browser from the same project that I've been talking about, where I created document sets based on sites. And in this case, a site actually represents a healthcare system that we went to and conducted interviews in. So part of the reason that I'm looking at sites and I created this document set is because we had many interviews within each one. So this is a way to sort of aggregate my data a little bit, if you will, and then also thinking about, identifying that system as the unit of analysis as opposed to individual interviews. This was also consistent, more consistent with our research questions. So what you're looking at here, all of these rows represent our codes, our qualitative codes. And then all of the columns are representing a different site. So this is a really quick and easy way to visualize patterns among codes that we've applied. And I can think about this in different ways. So I could take a site and sort of look down across all of these rows in the site and think about, is there a pattern in terms of the codes that are being applied? And you can see, pretty obvious, there are a few. So for site one, for instance, these codes around personnel, function, and then down near the bottom, education, training and education, those were commonly applied. If I go over here to site three, I see this code rapid response teams was applied more often there. Or it was applied more often really than any other code within that site. So that might be interesting to look at. I could also look at a particular row or code across all of these sites as well. So here, again, some interesting patterns, might emerge. If I go down to training and education, someone that then says ACLS after it, I can look across this and I can see really pretty easily a quick visual pattern of the number of times that code has been applied across these different sites. And remember, these are document sets, so there are multiple interviews within each one of these. So again, that could be helpful. It's starting to identify some patterns. As with the code relations browser, I can then actually obtain the segments of text behind these boxes or numbers, whatever it is I'm looking at. So then I can read through and make sense of that in more detail. So I want to then move over now actually to MAXQDA. So I'm just going to reshare here just so that we can look at this in a little bit more detail, and I can kind of walk through some of these. And then I see a question here: are the sites equal to document sets or individual documents? So for me, it was a document set, and within each document set, I had a number of documents, and I'll show that to you in just one moment here. Okay. All right, so hopefully you can see my MAXQDA file now. This is from that same project. So we had quite a few interviews, over 100 interviews. It's a very large study, and the software and these visual tools were incredibly helpful in making sense of that. So I'll just go to some of those tools that we've talked about already. So starting with MaxMaps. So I clicked on MaxMaps. And again, I would encourage you to, if you're interested in MaxMaps, really do a deep dive into it, because there's a lot more than I can cover here. So for one, when you're in MaxMaps, I can create a new map just from scratch. And I can call this, map of codes, for instance. And then I can just simply drag elements from MaxQDA over into this. I can then create links between them. Let me just go ahead and bring one more code. So by clicking this link button, I can indicate there's a relationship here, maybe there's a relationship here, and maybe not another one here. Although it would probably be over a little bit. So you can move these around. You can edit this really in innumerable ways. If I click on a particular line, I can change the line. So I have just a single line here, or I can have it unidirectional or bidirectional. I can make, fancier lines as well. I can change the color, shape, all of those sorts of things. So again, there's a lot of options here. So within MaxMaps, you see that this is saved. So once I label that, it's saved. And this is basically a browser of maps. MaxQDA also programs in some models for creating MaxMaps. So I would encourage you to look at these. So there are new document models. There are also new code models. The difference is that the document models are really focused on the document. So it's saying, I want to focus on the document. And then, for example, with the single case model, I can focus on a document. And then what I can do, or a document group or document set, and then I can see sort of all codes that have been applied there. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring over a document set. And as you see here, it started to populate this. It does look kind of messy. So let me just clean this up a little bit. So we have lots of options here. I can display memos. I can limit the number of codes that I want to display. And then right here, I had it defaulted to show the actual coded segment. So I can click that off. And rather than showing the text, that actual segment of text, I can just see the code label itself. And that's what you see here. So here are the 5 most frequently most frequently applied codes for Site 1 in particular. So this is a little bit easier to digest. So it's one way to just start to look at those patterns. I can change that to say the 10 most frequent if I want. I can have the line reflect the frequency of the application of that code. So again, I can edit this in quite a few ways. And then I'm going to just come up to the top here, and I'm going to select Use Model. So here's the single case model. Alternatively, we have a lot of options for code-based models. So this is saying I want to focus on the code and then see, for example, documents for which that's been applied. So let's do a single code model. And here is an example of where you can have coded segments, or you can focus on summaries as well. I'll focus on coded segments, and then it's asking me to bring a code over. So I'll bring over this code about training and education. Informal training and education was one of our most frequently applied codes. So again, here by default, and this is just how I've been using it lately, it's having the coded segment of text. I'll turn that off, so instead you could see the actual memos that are related to that, just to make it a little bit easier to read. Alternatively, I could show the coded segment of text, and I could only show, say, 5 of these, so it's a little bit easier to digest. In the label here, it's showing the coded text. Instead, I could have comments, so I could see all comments that I've written for that as well. So you have a lot of options. It's just a different way to visualize your data. I'll just click Use the Model. And at this point, I can drag things around a little bit to make it a little bit easier to visualize. Within this, you can move things around, you can edit, you can add titles. So there are really quite a few options. And then, of course, this is saved in my browser, in my MaxDAYS browser, and I could come over here and I could rename this to something else if I would like. All right, so that's just a quick tour of Max Maps. Let me move over now to the Code Relations browser and the Code Matrix browser, which is the order in which I talked about them, and it's honestly the order in which I use them. I'm not sure why necessarily, but it's just sort of how I start really with a Code Relations browser. So here I can select codes that I want to focus on. So I'll come down to some of these, I call these holistic codes, and I'll just select a few of them just so you can see what this might look like. Okay. All right, so I'll click OK at this point. So here I have 10 codes that I've selected as rows. And then for columns, I could select those same ones. I could select top level codes, but I'll just go ahead and select some too. Of course, if I had codes activated, that would be an easy way to do that as well. So I'll click OK. Here are my options for intersection versus proximity. I'll keep it based on intersections. So again, this is a way to look at patterns. So I see, instances in which these have co-occurred more frequently than others. If I come to any of these and I click on it, I'm just going to kind of drag this out of the way so you can see. So what it did here in my retrieve segments is that it built out this query, and it's saying that this is an intersection. So I know that that's a query that came, in this case, from the Code Relations browser. And then I can read through those segments of text and see if they're meaningful or not. Alternatively, you could use this to develop an interactive quote matrix to really just kind of flip over to that. And this is working really in a similar way, but it's allowing you to then dynamically kind of step through each of those cells, if you will, and read the segments of text. The interactive quote matrix is, one of my go-to favorite features of MAXQDA, and I'm really glad to see that in the Code Relations browser now. So that would probably be my recommendation for how you would actually use this. But if you prefer to work out of retrieve segments, you could just click on these and just focus on a few at a time as well. So either way is fine. So then moving on to the Code Matrix browser. So here's where we're able to compare columns as either documents, document groups, or document sets. I'll say document sets. This is also a great tool if you have focus group speakers and you want to compare. So here I have it just showing the actual number of instances of codes. I'll show how I can change those boxes instead. Similarly, I can click on one of these, and let me just get this out of the way for you. And we can see that it built that query and retrieve segment. It tells me that it's from the Code Matrix browser. So now I can read through that in more detail. Similarly, I can also get to the interactive quote matrix from this as well. So here I can click on a code and then read site by site and make those comparisons and really, try to understand patterns, try to make sense of this, thinking about if there are themes. This is an excellent tool if you're doing a cross-case analysis as well. I would highly recommend you look into that. All right, so let me go back over at this point to the slides, and we'll spend just a few minutes going through some more slides. Let me just make sure we're not interrupted here. All right, so starting with the code map, and I'll get to questions in about 5 minutes or so. I just want to review some of these additional tools. So the code map is kind of like the Code Relations browser, but it essentially visualizes things for you. So if there's increased similarity between codes, they'll appear closer together within this code map. The similarity just with a Code Relations browser can be determined based on intersections, proximity, or if two codes have just simply co-occurred together within a document. A document map then is looking at it from a different perspective, where your focus is on the document and it's looking at similarity of documents in terms of the codes that are assigned. And you can choose which documents and which codes you want to focus on. I think this could be an excellent tool if you want to compare cases if, for instance, a document is a case. So I could think about, which of these are more similar, which are more different. It could be helpful in a cross-case comparison in terms of code design. So a document comparison chart then is looking at the sort of the flow of codes or the application of codes within a document. So we see here that we have all of these rows are representing a different document, that same data set. And these columns are really broken down into segments, or I would say portions of the transcript. So think of paragraphs or lines as you go through that. This could be really helpful if you have a structured document, or if you really want to look at, say, the flow of language or the flow of conversation and really compare that. One thing that's important with the document comparison chart is that the color coding must be meaningful in some way. So you've maybe used color coding to indicate sentiment, or you're, say, dimensionalizing a code into positive or negative, for instance. So you could use this as kind of a way to visualize that. Also helpful in discourse analysis. A document portrait then is focusing on a single document. So it's kind of zooming in on just one of those documents. Again, it does, to a certain extent, rely on you having a meaningful use of color, because you're visualizing it based on color and identifying your codes. But you can order this in different ways. So you could order it just in terms of the document and the flow of the document, so the paragraphs. So you can see the flow of codes, and that's kind of what I'm looking at right here. You could organize it by color as well. So say you had it dimensionalized into positive or negative sentiments, for instance. You could see if there was primarily positive or primarily negative, or whatever you might be focusing on. And then you could also look at it sort of by color itself, including the frequency, if you want to look at proportions of those, sort of like what I just said. So the code line then is a way to see an overview of where codes were applied, really in a paragraph by paragraph way. So this here is an excerpt from a code line that I ran from that same project. So the columns represent paragraphs, and they're grouped into chunks of 10 lines, 10 paragraphs, if you will. And then I've selected just a group of codes. I've really focused on a group of codes that I want to include and focus on. So this is a way to look at kind of the flow of ideas or flow of topics throughout an interview based on what we've coded. Again, it could be useful if you have a structured conversation, or if you're looking at dialogue. But even for this, it was kind of interesting. And it came out, in essence, how I expected. So I'll just point out a few of these things. So for this, at least for this particular set that I was focusing on, so during things that are happening during an actual cardiac arrest event that happens, that is something that came up early in the conversation, so around lines 11 through 20, and then later on return to that as well with a little discussion throughout. Holistic processes, these are things that kind of span everything, and it actually reflects how we thought about that, and those sort of came up really throughout the interview, throughout many parts of the interview. So you see in this holistic processes that it was something that people talked about really throughout. So again, that could be useful for identifying patterns. So a profile comparison chart, and there's just a couple more that I want to talk about, and I'm almost near the end here. This is a way where you can profile essentially by document group, or document set, the counts of actual codes, and you can also bring variables into this as well. So the number of times that a code has been applied, say within a document set. So the idea is that you can use this to get a pattern. I have an excerpt here from the example file. This is from Work-Life Balance, actually looking at a focus group transcript. So you can see we have a legend here on the left-hand side, so that identifies the document, or the speaker, I guess, within the document in this case. So you can see that effects on studies. So for instance, this yellow line, that was Andy. That's something that Andy talked about more relative to others. And Andy also talked about psychological effects more relative to others. So you can profile really, again, that application of codes. And again, this is based on, count. So that may or may not be useful in terms of what you're doing. But it could, the presence or absence of a code or a topic could be helpful. Word trends then is kind of zooming in at a really specific level where you can use a line chart looking at sections of a document. So it's divided into 10 equal sections, if you will. And you could look at the application I should say the instance of a particular word based on frequency. So you can see the frequency of words within a document. You could look at where words tend to occur in a document. So from the example project I've been looking at, I selected 3 words that came up often. So team, arrest, and then also code. Not in the qualitative sense, but it's a term. If there's a code blue, it means someone's gone into cardiac arrest. And what the word trends is showing me is essentially a pattern of how often those words came up throughout the document. So we can see that the term code really, came up quite a bit early on within the documents. And then there was sort of a lull, and then it came up more, in the last half of the document as well. So again, and you can easily compare that to something like team, for instance, that did not really come up as often until closer to the end of the interview. So again, that may or may not be helpful, but it's a way to look at a pattern of word occurrences. And you can also send this to the QTT matrix, the question, themes, and theories worksheet, as is true really with any of these visual tools. So it's a way to document really that audit trail of your analysis, and I think ultimately help to build insights in terms of what it is you learned. So for all of these visual tools, keep in mind the unit of analysis, and it does kind of vary. Are you focusing on a case as a document? Are you focusing on a single document, a set of documents? What are you actually focusing on? Keep that in mind. Or with Max Maps, maybe you're focusing on the code really instead. I think that the code matrix browser and code relations browser are really helpful for just looking at initial patterns. That's how I tend to use them. Some of these tools really do rely on color coding being established for code. So think about your use of color within the codes themselves, or within labeling a code, I should say. And then also note that for some of these, the actual order is what's important. So the order in which, say, words came up, as we just saw in the word trends, or the order of codes being applied might be important. So those are different analytical questions that you might have for some of these tools. All right. So let me see what questions might have come up at this point, if there are any. Okay, so I think I answered the question about document sites. Did you publish the results of the study? Yeah, we have probably 5 related papers from this now, and I would be happy to share citations, of course, happy to do that. So what are the merits of document sets versus document variables for clustering and finding differences by demographics? So it's an excellent question. It depends sort of on what you're trying to do, for instance. So a document set is something that you can use. You can use document sets if you're using the code relations browser, if you're using the code, not the code relations browser, if you're using the code matrix browser. So in essence, you're kind of limited in terms of which of these tools are applicable depending on what you're doing. For that particular study, I actually had document sets set up to identify the sites, but I also had variables as well. And the reason I had both is because having document variables for clustering, opens up additional tools that you might be able to use that are available, particularly under the mixed methods tab. So for instance, crosstabs is an option if you have document variables. You could also run an interactive quote matrix from that crosstab, or create an interactive quote matrix that allows you to compare or cluster find differences by variables. So it kind of depends on what you do. Again, I would tend to have document variables for all demographics, just because I feel like it gives me a lot of options. And then if you would want to be able to use some other tools, you could create a set from that variable as well. So I hope that answered your question. Is it possible to do automatic hierarchical code subcode model for the whole system in MaxMaps? It's a good question. So hierarchical, so if you're looking at kind of a relationship of codes and then subcodes, yeah, you can do that. That is, so within MaxMaps, let me think here. So there's a hierarchical code subcode model. It's under the code model. Specifically, it's under a new code model. And I can show that in a second, I think, if we should have enough time to do so. So let me go back to MaxQDA. So if I come to MaxMaps, and then if I come to code models, I can do this hierarchical code subcode model. So I can drag over, and I don't have these nested very, very deep at this point. I just have one. But this is one way to do it. I wonder if maybe what you're asking about, though, is if you can do that for sort of the entire system. So rather than just a single code at a time, if you could do this for all of your code. So if I would be able to track all of these. And that, I'm not aware of a way to automatically do that. It's something that you could create manually. But I don't believe there's a way to include multiple codes in a hierarchical code subcode model. But if anyone has a better answer to that, please feel free to correct me if I understand your question correctly. Okay, great. And then can you comment on how MaxQDA use is described or presented in methodology sections of articles, and point to articles published where you use MaxQDA? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would usually include at least a line or two, just as if you were conducting quantitative analysis, you might say that use SPSS version 27 or SAS or Stata. I would say that, I used MaxQDA version 2022 for analysis. So a line like that, and then cite, per your citation style. So in APA, you would cite Verdi and, give probably 2023 as your citation for that, or whenever the most recent release was. I've also included lines where I've indicated a specific feature that I was using. So for example, I've said that we conducted mixed methods analysis using using the interactive quote matrix in MaxQDA. You could certainly point to specific visual tools. I mean, I would see that as a strength, actually. Let me see here. I might be able to really quickly find the exact phrasing that I use for one of those, if that would be helpful. Okay, so I did find one of these. So let me share my screen one more time. All right, so here is one of the articles from that very study we were looking at. This is published in BMJ Quality and Safety, which is a really good journal. So if you come down to the methods section under data analysis, so my first line here, we imported transcripts into MaxQDA qualitative software to manage data and facilitate analysis. I would not assume that every reader is going to know what MaxQDA is, so that's why I kind of try to define it as a qualitative software. Sometimes I'll say a qualitative and mixed methods software. And then I go into more detail about our actual methods of analysis and so on. And then coming over here, I mentioned it again. So we attempted to identify optimal nursing roles by analyzing code reports from MAXQDA's interactive quote matrix early in the process to compare for higher and lower performing hospitals, and so on. So those are just a couple of examples of when I've specifically mentioned MAXQDA within a manuscript. So, all right, so hopefully that was helpful. And again, I'm happy to share some citations. Let's see, you're welcome to email me. Anyone who has questions after this workshop is welcome to email me. I put my email address here on the bottom. This is my university email, tguetter@umich.edu. So at minimum, if I can't figure out a way to share some citations, you can send me an email and I will send those to you as well. But it should be pretty easy to gather. Other questions that you might have. So could you show again the interactive coded, so that interactive quote matrix? Yep, sure. Let me go back to that. Let's just share a different way here. Okay. So for one, we were on the code relations browser. So that's one way I got to it. And there's a little icon in the upper left, and this is the icon for the interactive quote matrix. So it looks like a matrix. There are 3 lines, and then in the lower corner, there's kind of like a hand pointing to it. So I clicked on that, and it opened up this interactive quote matrix. So if I click on any of these codes that I have, it's going to it takes a second. This is a very large data set. It starts to populate those actual overlapping coded segments of text. One thing I didn't show, but it actually gives you a hyperlink to that particular section of the transcript. So if you want to read that in context, you can click on that, and then I'll just kind of get this out of the way. I'll get a lot of these out of the way. So I clicked on that, and then if we come here, it took me to Site 1, Audio 3, and then Position 82. So it's exactly where we were. So that's how one way you can get to the interactive quote matrix. Within the code matrix browser itself, you can also get to the interactive quote matrix. So, you want to see the actual segments of text behind these boxes or blocks. So it's this icon in the upper left. So I'll click on that, and it builds this window. And the reason it's interactive is because you can step through really code by code. So it's a way to be really systematic. So I'm on this code for prognostication, and at this point, I'm able to kind of look across sites, read through these segments of text, make sense of them. It shows me again a hyperlink to the specific location of that coded segment of text, so I can read it in much more detail. So I find it really, really a helpful tool. So let me close this, and I'll close this. And then just because you asked, I'll show you another way you can just build an interactive quote matrix. It's kind of outside of our scope here, but it's certainly a visual tool. So within the Mixed Methods tab, you can come to the interactive quote matrix, and there are actually options. You can do this for focus groups as well. I don't have focus groups in this particular study, but it opens an interactive quote matrix. And then this is where I was saying that it kind of depends on document sets versus document variables, how you want to use it. So here I actually have columns set up already. This is how I used it for that paper you just saw. And each one was a variable, a document variable based on performance. And it was high, middle, and lower performing hospitals in terms of survival. So that's what these columns represent. So I'll click OK. And then at this point, I can click on any code and I can compare across performance levels. So that's yet another way you can access an interactive quote matrix. But this is different in that it does rely on having document variables that are set up. But this was exactly the tool I used in that paper that I just showed you, where I said we use the interactive quote matrix to compare snippets. So it's really quite valuable. So we are approaching the end of the session here. Any final questions before we close? I do want to thank you for joining. Thanks for being willing to stick with us and learn a little bit about these visual tools. I'm passionate about them. I use them in my own work. And again, feel free to follow up if I can be of any assistance. But I will try to find a way to share those citations as soon as I can. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the conference and rest of your day, wherever you are.